His name was Rudy Pompilli, and he is one of the most famous musicians you've likely never heard of. But you know his work. You know it in your bones. The wild, honking saxophone solo on the original recording of Rock Around the Clock was played by a brilliant session musician named Joey Ambrose. But the man who took that solo on stage, night after night across the globe, and turned it into a legendary visual performance was Rudy Pompilli. He became the face and the spirit of that sound. That solo was more than just a musical break. It was the sound of a cultural alarm clock, the 12-bar scream that woke up an entire generation of teenagers and terrified their parents. It was the sound of the rock and roll rebellion being born, and Rudy Pompilli was the man sounding the alarm. As the star saxophonist for Bill Haley and His Comets, he stood at the very center of a global firestorm, his acrobatic, high-energy performances making him a visual icon of the revolution that changed the world. Yet his story is not the one we've come to expect from rock and roll legends. This wasn't a tale of a tragic, youthful flameout in a blaze of glory. It was a story of a quiet professional, a master of his craft, who experienced unimaginable fame, only to endure a long, slow fade into obscurity. And most profoundly, it's a story of almost superhuman dedication, of a man who, when faced with a fatal illness, refused to lay his instrument down. He chose instead to play that joyful, life-affirming solo every single night, even as the act itself was stealing the very breath from his lungs. How does a man who helped create a revolution become its forgotten soldier? This is the story of Rudy Pompilli and the quiet dignity with which he stood his post, long after the world had forgotten his name. To truly understand the seismic, culture-shattering impact of a song like Rock Around the Clock and a band like Bill Haley and His Comets, you have to transport yourself back to the strange, quiet, and deceptively calm world of post-war America in the early 1950s. On the surface, it was an era of unprecedented peace and prosperity, a nation taking a deep collective breath after the traumas of the Great Depression and the Second World War. The economy was booming, and millions of families were leaving the crowded cities behind, settling into a new, comfortable, and deeply conformist life in the sprawling, manicured lawns of suburbia. This was the age of the man in the gray flannel suit, a time when the ultimate ideals were stability, security, and fitting in. The culture was overwhelmingly adult-oriented, and the popular music of the day was the perfect, soothing soundtrack to this age of comfortable conformity. The airwaves and the record charts were dominated by the smooth, reassuring, and deeply parental sounds of the crooners. Singers like Perry Como with his relaxed, almost sleepy baritone, Frankie Lane with his powerful, dramatic delivery, and the wholesome girl-next-door voices of Patti Page and Rosemary Clooney were the undisputed kings and queens of popular music. Their songs were lushly orchestrated, beautifully sung, and emotionally safe. They sang of sentimental love, of novelty concepts, of a world that was predictable and orderly. It was music for adults, music to be listened to quietly in the living room on the family radiogram after a long day at the office. It was the sound of the establishment. But beneath this calm, placid surface of mainstream pop, two powerful subterranean rivers of music were flowing, largely unseen and unheard by the white, middle-class audience that advertisers and major record labels were so focused on. In the cities and towns of the American South and in the burgeoning urban ghettos of the North, there was the raw, vibrant, and deeply human sound of rhythm and blues. Marketed on what were condescendingly called race records, this was the authentic, unfiltered music of Black America. It was the sound of artists like the great blues shouter Big Joe Turner, the wild king of the jukebox Wynonie Harris, and the soulful Ruth Brown. It was a music of raw emotion, of driving, danceable beats, and of often frankly sexual lyrics that would have made Perry Como blush. It was the sound of the Saturday night party, played out on independent record labels like Atlantic and Chess, and flowing alongside it out of the hills and hollows of Appalachia and the rough and tumble honky-tonks of the Southwest was country and western, or hillbilly music, as it was often dismissively called. This was the music of the white working class, the sound of artists like the tragic poet Hank Williams, the smooth-voiced Lefty Frizzle, and the honky-tonk king Webb Pierce. It was a sound of heartache, hard drinking, sin, and salvation, a music that told the simple, profound, and often painful stories of everyday life. These two great streams of American vernacular music were, for the most part, kept completely separate by the rigid racial, social, and commercial segregation of the time. They were the music of the margins, the sounds of the other America. But something new, something volatile, was happening in the culture. For the first time in history, a new social and economic force was emerging, a demographic that hadn't really existed before, the teenager. Thanks to the post-war economic boom, these young people, the first generation not to be defined by depression or war, had something their parents never had in their youth: leisure time and disposable income. They had pocket money from part-time jobs, money for records, for movie tickets, for clothes, for magazines, and they had a deep, desperate, almost primal hunger for a culture that was entirely their own. They were tired of the sentimental, adult-oriented music of their parents. They were a powder keg of restless, hormonal energy, a generation searching for a sound that could match the frantic, confused, and exhilarating rhythm of their own lives. They were waiting for a spark. That spark was about to be provided by a slightly unlikely 30-year-old former country and western bandleader with a signature kiss curl from Chester, Pennsylvania, named Bill Haley. Haley was a musical visionary, a man who stood with one foot in the world of country music and the other in the world of rhythm and blues. He heard the raw, driving backbeat of R&B. He felt the storytelling power and melodic structures of country music. And he had a revolutionary, almost heretical idea. What if you could fuse them together? What if you took the energy of a jump blues song and played it with the instrumentation and the frantic slap bass of a country and western band? The result of this musical alchemy was a new hybrid sound. It was loud, it was exciting, it was perfect for dancing, and it would soon have a name: rock and roll. All he needed was a band that could play it with the necessary fire and a horn player who could give it its wild, screaming, and rebellious voice. Rudolph Clement Pompilli was not a product of the rock and roll revolution. He was a seasoned, highly skilled professional who was about to be drafted into its front lines. He was born on April 16th, 1924, in the gritty industrial town of Chester, Pennsylvania, a working-class city on the banks of the Delaware River. His was a world away from the country and western music halls and rural radio stations that were shaping Bill Haley's early career in the same state. Pompilli was the son of Italian immigrants, and he grew up in a community where music was not a form of teenage rebellion, but a craft, a trade, a serious profession that demanded dedication and discipline. He was a gifted and deeply dedicated musician from a very early age. He fell in love with the saxophone, and with the obsessive, single-minded focus that would define his character for the rest of his life, he dedicated himself to mastering the instrument. His heroes were not the lonesome yodelers of country music. They were the sophisticated, technically dazzling, and harmonically complex titans of the swing and jazz eras. Men like the great Coleman Hawkins, the lyrical Lester Young, and the wild, honking R&B pioneer Illinois Jacquet. Rudy spent thousands of hours in his youth practicing scales, learning music theory, perfecting his tone, and absorbing the lessons of the masters. By the time he came of age in the 1940s, during the Second World War, he was a consummate professional, a journeyman musician making his living in the highly competitive world of jazz and swing big bands. This was his apprenticeship, his university. He learned about discipline, about the incredible physical and mental stamina required to play for hours on end, night after night in dance halls and ballrooms. He learned how to read complex musical charts on sight, how to blend seamlessly with a full horn section, and, most importantly, how to step forward into the spotlight and deliver a powerful, inventive, and crowd-pleasing solo when his moment came. In the early 1950s, as the golden era of the big bands was winding down, Rudy adapted, as all good professional musicians must. He formed his own group, a smaller, leaner jazz and R&B combo. They became a popular and highly successful fixture on the bustling club and ballroom circuit of the Philadelphia and Delaware Valley region. Rudy was a bandleader, a man known and respected by his peers for his incredible musicianship, his unwavering professionalism, and his innate ability to connect with and entertain a crowd. He was a successful working musician, a man who had already paid his dues and had carved out a comfortable and respected place for himself in the established musical order of the day. Meanwhile, just a few miles away, another local musician was on a very different and much more revolutionary trajectory. Bill Haley had started his career in the 1940s as a genuine country and Western singer, a yodeler and guitarist who led a popular local band called the Saddlemen. But Haley was a shrewd and observant man. He saw the world changing around him. He noticed that the young white kids who came to his shows were polite during the country ballads, but they went wild during the upbeat, rhythm and blues-inflected numbers he was beginning to incorporate into his set. He saw the future, and it wasn't wearing a cowboy hat. In a move that was both commercially savvy and artistically revolutionary, he made a complete transformation. He traded in his cowboy hat for a suit and tie, told his steel guitarist to turn up the volume, and emphasized a heavy driving drum beat. He renamed his band the Comets, and in 1953, they had a major regional hit with a song called Crazy Man, Crazy, a frantic, high-energy record that is now widely considered by music historians to be one of the very first true rock and roll hits. By 1955, Bill Haley and his Comets were on the absolute verge of a national and international breakthrough. They had a record deal with the major label Decca, and they had a secret weapon, a song they had recorded a year earlier called We're Gonna Rock Around the Clock. But Haley, the canny bandleader, knew his band was still missing one crucial ingredient. He needed a saxophonist who was more than just a great player. He needed a showman. He needed a handsome, charismatic visual foil to his own slightly goofy, avuncular stage presence. His current sax player was a fine musician, but he lacked the fire, the wildness, the visual flair that this new, rebellious, and highly visual music demanded. Haley had heard about a brilliant, handsome, and incredibly dynamic sax player who was leading his own successful band in the area, a man who could not only play with incredible power and technique, but who could also put on a spectacular show. His name was Rudy Pompilli. Haley approached Pompilli and made him a lucrative offer to join the Comets. Initially, Rudy was hesitant. He was a band leader in his own right, a man used to being in charge, a man with a steady and reliable income from his own successful group. Joining the Comets would mean becoming a sideman, a hired hand. But he was also a shrewd professional. He saw the incredible energy and excitement that was building around Bill Haley. He knew that this new hybrid music was not just a fad, it was the future. He took the gig. It was a professional decision, a calculated risk made by a seasoned veteran of the music business. It was a decision that would, in a matter of mere months, place him at the very center of a global cultural firestorm. He had been a successful, respected journeyman musician for over a decade. He was about to become a household name, an icon of a revolution. He was a successful, respected journeyman musician who had made a smart career move, joining the hottest new act in his region. He was about to become an icon of a revolution. But in that autumn of 1955, as Rudy Pompilli packed his saxophone and went on the road with his new boss, no one could have possibly predicted the scale of the explosion that was about to occur. They were still just a band, playing a new and exciting kind of music for dancing. They had no idea that a forgotten song, a controversial new film, and an entire generation of restless teenagers were about to collide, creating a cultural big bang that would make them, for a time, the most famous and most dangerous band on the entire planet. In the late autumn of 1955, after Rock Around the Clock had already exploded into a worldwide phenomenon thanks to the film Blackboard Jungle, Bill Haley and his Comets underwent a lineup change. 3 key members left to form their own group, the Jodamars. To fill the crucial saxophone role, Haley hired Rudy Pompilli, a respected bandleader from the Philadelphia area known for his powerful playing and dynamic stage presence. Pompilli wasn't stepping onto a rocket ship on the launch pad. He was hired to be a star pilot on a rocket already in mid-flight. The song that would propel them into the stratosphere, We're Gonna Rock Around the Clock, had already been recorded a year earlier in 1954, with a session musician named Joey D'Ambrosia laying down the original fiery saxophone solo. But upon its initial release, the record had been a commercial dud, a strange, new, and slightly jarring sound that the world was not quite ready for. It had flickered briefly and then vanished, a revolution that had failed to ignite. The Comets were a successful, hard-working touring band, but they were not yet a phenomenon. Rudy Pompilli, the consummate professional, had simply joined another good, steady gig. The fuse that would light that rocket ship and send it screaming into history was not lit in a recording studio or on a radio station. It was lit in the darkened auditorium of a movie theater. In the spring of 1955, the film Blackboard Jungle was released. It was a gritty, sensationalistic, and for its time, deeply shocking social problem drama about an idealistic new teacher trying to connect with a gang of violent, rebellious, and disillusioned students in an inner-city high school. The film's director, Richard Brooks, was searching for a piece of music to play over the opening credits, a song that would perfectly capture the defiant anti-authoritarian spirit of his teenage characters. The story of how he found it has become a cornerstone of rock and roll lore. The film's star, Glenn Ford, had a teenage son, Peter, who was a fan of this new underground music. Peter had a copy of Bill Haley's forgotten single in his record collection. He played it for his father, who in turn played it for the director. The moment Brooks heard the song's frantic, driving beat and Haley's almost manic vocal delivery, he knew he had found his anthem. It was the sound of the very teenage rebellion his film was depicting. When Blackboard Jungle opened in cinemas across America and then the world, the effect of that opening sequence was instantaneous and utterly electrifying. As the film's imposing, authoritative opening titles rolled, announcing the serious social problem the audience was about to witness, The speakers didn't fill with a dramatic orchestral score. Instead, they exploded with that iconic cracking snare drum beat, that simple, insistent countdown. 1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. For the millions of teenagers sitting in those darkened theaters, something snapped. For the first time in the history of popular culture, they were hearing their music, their secret rebellious sound, not on a tinny transistor radio hidden under their pillows, but blasting out of the massive speakers of a movie house. It was a moment of profound, exhilarating validation. This wasn't their parents' music. This was loud, it was defiant, and it was telling their story. They saw their own restless, misunderstood energy reflected back at them from the silver screen. The reaction was unprecedented, and to the adult world, utterly terrifying. Teenagers who had been expected to sit in quiet, polite deference in cinemas suddenly got up out of their seats and began to jive and dance in the aisles. In some cities, the excitement boiled over into out-and-out rioting. Seats were slashed, bottles were thrown at the screen. The moral establishment was horrified. This new rock and roll music, this jungle music, was branded as a dangerous, corrupting influence, a primal savage noise that was inciting the nation's youth to violence and moral degeneracy. Of course, this wave of parental panic and media condemnation only made the song and the band infinitely cooler and more popular. Decca Records, sensing a phenomenon, immediately re-released Rock Around the Clock. This time, it did not flop. It shot to the #1 position on the Billboard charts in the United States, where it stayed for 8 weeks. It became the first rock and roll record to top the charts, a clear and undeniable signal that a new cultural era had dawned. It went on to become a #1 hit in Britain, in Germany, in Australia, in almost every country where it was released. It was, quite literally, the shot heard round the world. The rock and roll era had officially, loudly, and controversially begun. And Rudy Pompilli, the new boy in the band, found himself at the very epicenter of this cultural hurricane. He had joined a successful touring act and, in a matter of months, had become a key member of the most famous and most infamous musical group on the planet. His life was transformed overnight. He went from playing to appreciative crowds in the ballrooms of Pennsylvania to performing in front of thousands upon thousands of screaming, hysterical fans in arenas and stadiums across the country and soon across the world. He was now tasked with a monumental responsibility to recreate, live on stage every single night, the iconic saxophone solo that had become the defining sound of this new teenage rebellion. And he did it with a power, a skill, and a spectacular showmanship that was breathtaking. Rudy Pompilli was not a static, stationary musician, content to stand still behind a music stand. He was a whirlwind of energy. He was handsome, he was charismatic, and he understood with the deep intuitive knowledge of a seasoned entertainer that this new music was as much about the visual spectacle as it was about the sound. He would perform astonishing feats of musical acrobatics, a tradition borrowed from the wilder R&B saxophonists of the 40s. He would lie on his back on the stage, kicking his feet in the air, or even climb on top of the string bass, all without missing a single note of his blistering, perfectly constructed solos. He would engage in playful call and response duels with the band's brilliant guitarist, Franny Beecher, the two of them trading hot licks like seasoned musical gunslingers. He became, alongside the slightly goofy, kiss-curled Haley himself, the visual and musical focal point of the Comets' legendary high-energy live shows. He was the handsome, cool, and slightly dangerous professional at the heart of the joyous chaos. From 1955 to 1958, Bill Haley and His Comets were, for all intents and purposes, the kings of rock and roll. They were the original missionaries of the new sound, the ones who took it out of the United States and introduced it to a hungry and waiting global audience. In the wake of Rock Around the Clock, they scored a relentless string of classic, foundational hits, songs that have become part of the very bedrock of popular music. There was See You Later, Alligator, with its infectious call and response chorus. There was their explosive, cleaned-up version of Big Joe Turner's R&B classic Shake, Rattle, and Roll. There was the frantic, joyous energy of Rip It Up. And every one of these records was powered by Rudy's raw, energetic, and perfectly crafted saxophone solos. He had become the defining instrumental voice of the band. They were a global phenomenon, and nowhere was their impact more profound than in Great Britain. In February of 1957, they became the first major American rock and roll act to tour the country. Their arrival was treated with the kind of media frenzy usually reserved for visiting royalty or Hollywood superstars. The tour was a monumental event. They were met with a level of fan hysteria that was completely unprecedented in British history, a clear and powerful foreshadowing of the Beatlemania that would erupt just a few years later. Thousands of screaming, adoring teenagers greeted their train at Waterloo Station in London, a scene of joyous, chaotic abandon that stunned the famously reserved British public and scandalized the press. The headlines screamed of this new savage American craze. Their concerts were sellouts, scenes of pure, unadulterated pandemonium. For a generation of young post-war British musicians, including a teenage John Lennon and Paul McCartney in Liverpool, a young Jimmy Page, and a young Jeff Beck seeing the Comets live, or even just seeing the newsreel footage of their arrival, was a life-changing, almost religious experience. It was the first time they had seen a real, authentic, high-energy rock and roll band in the flesh. And a huge part of that authentic power was the raw, untamed, and wonderfully exciting sound of Rudy Pompilli's saxophone. But the reign of Bill Haley and his Comets at the very top of the rock and roll world was destined to be a short and turbulent one. The very revolution they had started was, by its very nature, built on the idea of youthful rebellion. And by 1958, the pioneers were already being outflanked by a new wave of younger, more charismatic, and more authentically rebellious stars. The cultural tsunami that was Elvis Presley had arrived. With his smoldering good looks, his scandalous swiveling hips, and a voice that dripped with a raw, primal sexuality, Elvis made Bill Haley seem, almost overnight, like a figure from a bygone era. Elvis was the teenage dream, the rebel without a cause that every girl wanted and every boy wanted to be. Bill Haley, a happily married man in his 30s, with a trademark kiss curl that was already beginning to thin, looked more like their slightly square, fun-loving dad. And Elvis was not alone. From the Deep South came a wave of wild, untamed rock and roll animals who made the Comets' good-natured boogie seem tame by comparison. There was Jerry Lee Lewis, the wild-eyed, piano-pounding killer from Louisiana, who seemed to be channeling the devil himself. There was Little Richard, the flamboyant, pompadoured, screaming architect of rock and roll from Georgia, whose performances were a whirlwind of sexual and spiritual ecstasy. And there was Chuck Berry, the duck-walking poet from St. Louis, who was not just a brilliant performer but a genius songwriter who was creating a new lyrical language for this new teenage generation. These new artists were not just playing rock and roll, they were living it. They were young, they were dangerous, and they were the real deal. Bill Haley and his Comets were the pioneers, the men who had hacked a path through the jungle. But the public's attention was now focused on the younger, more exotic creatures who were following in their wake. The very revolution Haley had started had already begun to move on without him. And Rudy Pompilli, the man who had played the opening fanfare, was now forced to watch as a new set of kings ascended to the throne. By the end of the 1950s, the imperial phase of Bill Haley and his Comets was over. At least in their home country of America, their records were no longer troubling the top of the charts, and they had been unceremoniously dropped by their major label, Decca, who were now focusing their attention on newer, younger rock and roll acts like Buddy Holly. The musical world had been turned on its head, first by the rise of Elvis and the first wave of rock and rollers, and then, in the early 60s, by the global domination of the British invasion bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. The raw, simple saxophone-driven sound of 50s rock and roll was now seen by a new generation of teenagers as quaint, old-fashioned, and hopelessly unsophisticated. But for the Comets, this was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new and in many ways more grueling and more complex chapter. While their popularity had waned to almost nothing in the United States, they discovered that they were still bona fide superstars, living legends in other parts of the world. In Europe, particularly in Britain and Germany, where their pioneering tours had left an indelible mark, and in Latin America, especially Mexico, and in Australia, the appetite for pure, unadulterated, original recipe rock and roll was still immense and insatiable. And so began the long second act of their career. They became musical exiles, one of the world's first and most successful nostalgia acts, endlessly touring the rock and roll revival circuits of the world. For the next 2 decades, their life was a relentless, punishing grind of international travel. They were perpetually on the road, playing the old beloved hits night after night to sold-out crowds of fans who wanted to recapture a piece of their lost youth. It was a world away from the cutting edge of popular music, which was now being defined by the sounds of psychedelic rock, soul, heavy metal, and singer-songwriters. But it was a good living. And for Rudy Pompilli, the consummate professional, the dedicated craftsman, it was his job. He was the undisputed anchor of the band during this long nomadic period. While other members of the classic Comets lineup, frustrated with the endless travel and the declining paychecks, came and went, Rudy remained. His loyalty to Bill Haley and to the music they had created unwavering. He was the band's musical director, the quiet professional core, the one who made sure that the shows were always tight, always polished, and always entertaining. He was the one who ensured that the legacy of the Comets was protected, that the music was always played with the respect and the energy it deserved. And every single night when his moment in the spotlight came, he would step forward and play that iconic blistering solo on Rock Around the Clock with the same ferocious energy and the same joyful passion as he had when he was a young man at the very center of a global revolution. But by the early 1970s, a dark and insidious shadow had begun to fall over Rudy's life, a personal battle that would test his professionalism, his spirit, and his very will to live in a way that no grueling tour schedule ever could. He was a heavy smoker, a habit he had picked up in his youth in the smoke-filled jazz clubs of the 40s, and after decades of indulgence, it was beginning to take a devastating toll on his health. He was about to face his final and most difficult performance. The very revolution Haley had started had already begun to move on without him, and Rudy Pompilli, the man who had played the opening fanfare, was now forced to watch as a new set of kings ascended to the throne. For many bands, this would have been the end of the story, a brief, brilliant flash of glory followed by a quiet breakup and a return to normal life. But the story of Bill Haley and his Comets and of Rudy Pompilli was different. Their fall from the top of the American charts was not an end, but the beginning of a new decades-long chapter as global ambassadors of rock and roll. It was the beginning of a long, hard road that would test their endurance, their friendship, and for Rudy, a profound and quiet loyalty that would ultimately ask him to make the greatest sacrifice of all. The story of popular music is more often than not a story of relentless, forward-moving change. The sound of today is the nostalgia of tomorrow. For Bill Haley and his Comets, the pioneers who had kicked down the door for the rock and roll revolution, this reality hit them harder and faster than almost anyone. By the dawn of the 1960s, the world they had helped to create had already cast them aside, at least in their home country. The arrival of the British invasion, spearheaded by the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, was the final nail in the coffin for the commercial viability of 50s-style rock and roll in America. For the Comets, it wasn't an ending at all. It was the start of a grueling second act on the global nostalgia circuit. While they were now largely ignored in the United States, they discovered that they were still bona fide superstars, living legends in other parts of the world. In Europe, particularly in Britain and Germany, where their pioneering tours had left an indelible and deeply cherished mark, and in Latin America, especially Mexico, and in Australia, the appetite for pure, unadulterated, original recipe rock and roll was still immense and insatiable. And so began the long second act of their career, a life lived out of a suitcase. They became musical exiles, one of the world's first and most successful nostalgia acts, endlessly touring the rock and roll revival circuits of the globe. For the better part of the next 2 decades, their life was a relentless, punishing, and often monotonous grind of international travel. It was a blur of airports, of second-tier hotels, of long, lonely bus rides through foreign countrysides, and every night they would step onto a stage in a different city and play the old, beloved hits, transporting an audience of middle-aged fans back to the glorious, rebellious days of their youth. It was a world away from the cutting edge of popular music, which was now being defined by the sounds of psychedelic rock, soul, heavy metal, and singer-songwriters. But it was a good, steady living. And for Rudy Pompilli, the consummate professional, the dedicated craftsman, it was his job. Across those suitcase years, Rudy became the band's steady center, musical director, disciplinarian, and morale officer. While other members of the classic Comets lineup, frustrated with the endless travel, the declining paychecks, and the sheer repetition of it all, came and went, Rudy remained. His loyalty to Bill Haley and to the music they had created was unwavering and absolute. He was the band's musical director, the quiet, professional core, the man who made sure that the shows were always tight, always polished, and always supremely entertaining, no matter how tired or homesick they all were. He was, in a very real sense, the custodian of the Comets' legacy, the man who ensured that the music was always played with the respect and the high-octane energy it deserved. And every single night, without fail, when his moment in the spotlight came, he would step forward and play that iconic, blistering solo on Rock Around the Clock with the same ferocious energy and the same joyful passion as he had when he was a young man at the very center of a global revolution. But by the early 1970s, a dark and insidious shadow had begun to fall over Rudy's life, a personal battle that would test his professionalism, his spirit, and his very will to live, in a way that no grueling tour schedule or fading spotlight ever could. He was a lifelong heavy smoker, a habit he had picked up in his youth in the smoke-filled jazz clubs of the 1940s, a common vice for a musician of his generation. And after decades of indulgence, it was beginning to take a devastating and irreversible toll on his health. He was about to be asked to make an impossible choice and to embark upon his final and most courageous performance. In 1974, after suffering from a persistent hacking cough and a noticeable loss of weight and energy, Rudy Pompilli finally went to see a doctor. The diagnosis was the one he had likely long feared. It was swift and it was brutal. He had advanced lung cancer. Given the state of medical science at the time, the prognosis was grim. The doctors gave him a stark, unequivocal ultimatum. He had to stop performing immediately. The immense physical exertion of playing the saxophone, of forcing air from his diseased lungs through the horn for 2 hours every single night, was, they told him, a form of slow suicide. The strain would, without question, accelerate the disease and shorten his already limited time. He was advised, in the strongest possible terms, to retire, to go home to his family, and to rest. Rudy Pompilli, the quiet professional, listened to his doctors. He heard their warnings. He understood the medical reality, and he respectfully, calmly, and defiantly ignored their advice. He was a musician. It was not just what he did, it was who he was. Playing was not just his job. It was his life, his purpose, his very reason for being. The thought of a life without music, without the easy camaraderie of his bandmates on a tour bus, without the roar of the crowd, without the feel of his saxophone in his hands, was for him a kind of living death. He was a man facing a terrible choice, a slightly longer life of quiet, empty, and meaningless decline, or a shorter life filled with the joy, the purpose, and the music that had sustained him for over 30 years. For Rudy, it was no choice at all. And so, in an act of almost unimaginable courage, dedication, and pure, unadulterated love for his craft, he went back on the road. The final years of Rudy Pompilli's life, from 1974 to early 1976, are a story of almost superhuman endurance and a testament to the profound and enduring power of the human spirit. He was a man living on borrowed time, a man who knew he was dying but who refused to be defined by his illness. He continued to tour relentlessly with the Comets, a decision that baffled his doctors and filled his friends and family with a mixture of awe and deep gnawing concern. This final period of his life was a grueling, agonizing ordeal. The cancer was ravaging his body. He was in constant, debilitating pain. He lost a tremendous amount of weight, and his once handsome, charismatic face became gaunt, pale, and etched with the lines of his suffering. The simple, unconscious act of breathing was now a conscious and often painful struggle. His bandmates from that final period would later recall, with a mixture of awe, reverence, and profound sadness, the reality of life on the road with him during this time. Before shows, he would be backstage, racked with terrible, soul-shaking coughing fits, sometimes secretly coughing up blood into a handkerchief so weak and frail that it seemed impossible he would be able to even walk, let alone perform. But then every single night something miraculous would happen. He would hear the roar of the crowd from the other side of the curtain. He would hear the opening notes of the first song, and he would walk out into those bright, warm lights, straighten his back, pick up his saxophone, and for the next 90 minutes he would become Rudy Pompilli, the rock and roll star, one more time. He would play with a fire, a fury, and a passion that seemed impossible for a man in his condition. He would summon a strength from some deep, hidden well of his spirit, and he would perform his trademark acrobatic moves. He would joke with the audience, and when the moment came for his legendary solo on Rock Around the Clock, he would pour every last remaining ounce of his life force, every last precious breath in his cancer-ridden body, into that horn. He was a man who was literally and knowingly playing himself to death night after night, because for him, it was the only way to truly live. His final tour was an exhausting multi-date engagement in Europe in late 1975. The band, and Rudy himself, knew this was the end of the road. His final performance was in Brussels, Belgium. It was, by all accounts, a triumphant show. He left the stage, as he always did, to a thunderous, loving ovation. Just days after returning home to his family in Pennsylvania, he was admitted to the hospital for the very last time. On February 5, 1976, Rudolph Clement Pompilli died from lung cancer. He was 51 years old. The man who had provided the joyful, rebellious, and life-affirming soundtrack for a generation was gone. Bill Haley was, by all accounts, utterly and completely devastated. He had lost not just his greatest and most loyal sideman, but his best friend, his musical conscience, the man who had stood faithfully by his side for 20 remarkable years through the dizzying highs of global superstardom and the long, slow decline into obscurity. Haley would continue to tour, but he would later tell friends and interviewers with a profound and enduring sadness that the Comets and his own spirit were never the same after Rudy's death. The heart of the band had been silenced. To truly understand Rudy Pompilli's incredible, almost fanatical dedication to his music and his band, you have to understand the kind of man he was and the era that shaped him. He was a product of a different time, a man forged in the professional codes of the jazz and swing world he had grown up in. For him, the show always had to go on. Your personal problems, your private pain, your sickness, you left all of that in the dressing room. When you walked out onto that stage, you had a job to do. And that job was to entertain the people who had paid their hard-earned money to see you, to give them the best possible show every single time without excuse or compromise. The other members of the Comets, in the countless interviews they have given over the years, all speak of him with the same mixture of love and deep, abiding respect. They remembered him not just as a brilliant world-class musician, but as the absolute bedrock of the band, the consummate professional who was, in many ways, its true leader. He was the one who made sure the band was always tight, always rehearsed, always looking sharp in their matching plaid jackets. He was the musical director, the quiet authority, the anchor in the often chaotic world of a touring rock and roll band. But he was not a stern, humorless taskmaster. He was also a man with a wicked sense of humor, a notorious and prolific prankster whose elaborate and often hilarious jokes on the road were the stuff of band legend. He was the one who would short-sheet the beds of his bandmates, who would orchestrate complex practical jokes involving unsuspecting hotel staff and local promoters, who would keep the mood light and the spirits up during the endless, boring, and soul-destroying hours of travel between gigs. He was the heart and the soul of the band, the man who made the long, hard road not just bearable, but fun. He was the brother that everyone in the Comets family looked up to. His loyalty to Bill Haley was absolute and unconditional. In the late 1950s, when the Comets' popularity in America began to wane and the original members of the classic lineup began to defect, frustrated with declining paychecks and seeking their own careers, Rudy stayed. He had numerous opportunities to leave, to join other more successful bands, but his sense of duty and his deep personal friendship with Haley were unwavering. This profound sense of loyalty and professionalism is the absolute key to understanding his final, tragic, and ultimately heroic decision to keep touring. He knew he was dying, but he also knew that without him, the band and Bill Haley would be in serious trouble. He was the biggest and most beloved star in the band next to Haley himself. He felt in the deepest part of his soul that he couldn't let them down. It was an act of incredible, almost unimaginable self-sacrifice, a final, powerful statement of his commitment to the music and to the men he had shared his life with. His story is a powerful, poignant reminder of a forgotten ideal in the often selfish, ego-driven world of popular music, the ideal of the dedicated professional, the man who puts the music and the band before himself, right up until the very, very end. The story of Bill Haley and his Comets is at the very center of one of the great, enduring, and delightfully unresolvable debates in popular music history: who really invented rock and roll? It's a complex and fascinating question with no simple answer. A story of parallel evolution, of multiple vital contributors, and of a sound that seemed to bubble up from the very soul of post-war America. There is a powerful and compelling argument to be made for a host of brilliant and often overlooked black artists. There is Ike Turner, whose 1951 record with Jackie Brenston, Rocket 88, is considered by many serious music historians to be the very first true rock and roll song. There are the foundational geniuses like Chuck Berry, who brought a new level of lyrical sophistication and guitar-driven showmanship to the form, and Little Richard, whose wild, transcendent, and gender-bending energy laid the blueprint for what it meant to be a rock and roll performer. And of course, there is the king himself, Elvis Presley, the man who took the sound and, with his electrifying charisma and his controversial, beautiful good looks, made it a global, youth-quaking phenomenon. So where do Bill Haley and his Comets, a band of white, middle-aged, former country musicians, fit into this complex and politically charged picture? They were, it must be said, not the sole inventors, but their role in the story was absolutely crucial, and it is often unfairly downplayed or dismissed. They were the ones who took the disparate underground elements of the sound, the driving backbeat of R&B, the melodic structures and storytelling of country, the frantic energy of jump blues, and fused them into a coherent, commercially viable package. And most importantly, they were the ones who had the first truly global mainstream and culture-defining hit. Rock Around the Clock was not the first rock and roll song, but it was the one that broke down the door. It was the song that took this new hybrid music out of the juke joints of the American South and the race record charts and put it into the living rooms of mainstream white America, and then into the cinemas and dance halls of the entire world. They were the spark that lit the fuse of a global revolution. And at the very heart of that spark, at the very center of their unique, groundbreaking sound, was the saxophone. In the modern guitar-centric view of rock history, it's easy to forget that in the earliest days of rock and roll, before the guitar hero was codified by Chuck Berry and his disciples, the saxophone was often the primary lead instrument. It was the instrument that provided the solos, the hooks, and the raw, screaming sexual excitement. Rudy Pompilli, along with other legendary session players of the era like Lee Allen in New Orleans and King Curtis in New York, was a key architect of this sound. His raw, honking, and wonderfully over-the-top playing on those classic Comets records was the defining instrumental voice of early rock and roll, the sound of a new generation joyfully and loudly breaking free from the staid, polite constraints of the past. His name may have been forgotten by the mainstream, but his sound is etched into the very DNA of the music that changed the world. Rudy Pompilli died in February of 1976. His passing, while devastating for his family, his friends, his bandmates, and the loyal international fan base of the Comets, went largely unnoticed by the wider world. By the mid-1970s, the raw, joyful rock and roll of the 1950s was seen by the mainstream music press and a new generation of rock fans as a historical curiosity, a piece of quaint black and white nostalgia from a simpler, more innocent time. The music world was now dominated by the stadium-sized progressive rock of Pink Floyd, the heavy metal of Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, and the decadent, androgynous spectacle of glam rock. The original pioneers of the 50s were seen as forgotten soldiers of a revolution that had long since been won, and in many cases had moved on to fight different wars. This historical amnesia is the central tragedy of the Comets story, and of Rudy Pompilli's. They were the ones who fired the first shots, who stormed the beaches of popular culture, and faced the initial withering barrage of moral condemnation from the establishment. But they were quickly overshadowed by the flashier, more charismatic and younger generals who followed them onto the battlefield. Rudy's death occurred at the absolute nadir of their historical reputation. It would take another decade, and the slow, steady work of rock and roll historians and new generations of fans for their pivotal, groundbreaking role to be properly reevaluated and for their legacy to be permanently secured. And what is that legacy? For Rudy Pompilli, it is, first and foremost, immortal, undeniable, and audible. It is that sound. It is the sound of that wild, joyful 12-bar saxophone solo, a piece of music that is as electrifying and as instantly recognizable today as it was when it first shocked the world in 1955. It is the sound of a cultural alarm clock, the sound of a revolution being joyfully and loudly born. But his deeper human legacy is as a powerful symbol of a forgotten archetype in the rock and roll story. The consummate professional, the loyal sideman, the master craftsman, whose name is unknown to the millions upon millions of people who know and love his work. He was not a tortured genius who died young in a blaze of glory. He was a working musician, a man who showed up, did his job with unparalleled skill and dedication, and who, in a final heroic act, put the music and his band before his own life. In the final analysis, the story of Rudy Pompilli is a quiet epic of dedication. He was a seasoned, sophisticated musician from the jazz age who found himself almost by accident at the very center of a raw, explosive teenage rebellion. He was the handsome, charismatic showman who became the perfect visual and musical foil to a man who was his boss and who became his best friend. He was a man who achieved unimaginable global fame, only to spend the next 2 decades as a traveling custodian of his own legend, faithfully and joyfully playing the hits of his youth to a world that seemed, for a time, to have forgotten him. His story is a powerful, poignant reminder that the history of rock and roll is not just a story of the flamboyant frontmen and the tortured guitar gods. It's also a story of the quiet professionals, the foundational architects, the men in the background whose names have been lost to time, but whose music is and will forever be immortal. Rudy Pompilli was not a tragic, romantic hero of the rock and roll myth. He was something more profound and perhaps more admirable, a good soldier. He was a man whose sense of duty and love for his craft were so profound that he literally played the music he loved until his very last breath. So the next time you hear that iconic cracking snare drum, the next time you hear that cheerful voice counting in the clock, wait for it. Wait for that 1 minute and 20-second mark. And when that raw, joyful, and utterly glorious saxophone solo kicks in, a sound that still feels like a declaration of independence, listen to it. And remember the name of the man who played it, the man who sounded the alarm, Rudy Pompilli.